Thank you, Sanjit, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. I know Fridays are a tricky day in every way, but I'm really glad that to see some known and some new faces. I should say that it's really a privilege to say a few words about Amit Chaudhuri. I won't say introduce, of course. I must say that I really feel very much at home with the angularity of this literary activism symposiums, with which I've been involved for several years now, since it's the first year. And it's kind of angular with respect to everything, with academia, literary festival, book launches. It doesn't fit in anywhere. And I should say that, the reason this comfort that I have with its angularity says a lot about who I have become as a reader, writer, thinker, teacher. And that has a lot to do with, with Amit Chaudhuri himself, his work, his early work, and my conversations with him that I've been having for, I think, almost 30 years now, ever since I was. So it's really quite fascinating. Very early, I think it was last years of high school is when I discovered his early novels, Strange and Sublime Address and Afternoon Rag. And it was very important to, as a kind of a idiom of a local modernism, as somebody who was writing, trying to write, find one's writing identity. It was fascinating to see a kind of a local modernism which was also deeply cosmopolitan, local, provincial, but cosmopolitan at the same time. And as anyone who's trying to find a writerly voice, it's very important, as we know, that what tradition do I belong to? What's my tradition? And I felt that here's my tradition. And one of the simple things was that how does one talk about the local and the vernacular in English? It was still the disjuncture. And in his work, I found the solution. There a lot of these options opened up. And that has stayed with me, for the longest time, as well as the fact that one could grow as a writer and a reader in an angular relationship with some of the dominant traditions. And that is also a confidence I think I've had reading his work, talking to him, and that one can be it's okay. And that really is fascinating. What I found, going forward in his work, many of his essays, was what I call a sense of an embodied intellect. That is where the intellect is also a thing of the body, where thinking is also a matter of physical existence, breathing, sunlight. It's like stream of consciousness. You think, and then you get a smell, and then you think again, and then you pause. And I love this sort of embodied, this kind of complete sensibility, which I found in Chaudhuri's work, in his essays, in his nonfiction, over the years. And that, many of his collections, Clearing a Space, or later works, more recent works, and obviously the symposium itself. So it's kind of really fascinating. And I think it's quite natural that a symposium on the depletion of the literary will come from this space of embodied intellect, which from the beginning has been carving out a kind of an alternative tradition of Indian writing in English. Those of you who know his Picador Book of Indian Literature, Modern Indian Literature, know that anthology itself, which he has talked about as a kind of a long essay with quotation marks. I'll be talking about it tomorrow myself. That it has this, so it's very interesting, and the selection itself, and this idea of the alternative tradition has been very clear, and it's and so in a way it's kind of almost expected that the symposium will come as an intervention to this public sphere. And what I particularly like is, I was talking about this at lunch, that how it uses the language of finance. And I just learned from Tim that it's also the language of card games, that bust as you go bust when you play cards. So there's this element of investment, this idea of over-investing in a banking system, and then so there's this fantastic fictional, imaginative, speculative element which runs our economies. And there's this speculative element which runs our literary traditions too, that we bet on certain things and then certain things go boom, certain things go bust, and obviously it has so many meanings. I just loved hearing about a bust archive from a sculptor, so clearly sculptor and bust as a whole other. I have some questions about whether what the bust stands for. Is the bust a bust tradition in sculpting? So what I like, and this is again very uniquely Chaudhuri, to kind of use the language of finance and banking, and now I know card games, to bring in the tradition of the literary. And this is again exactly in keeping with the writer, the friend I've known for all these years, and again what I'm getting here, I'm very curious about it. I've heard him speak about the Bengal Renaissance, write about it for many years, but the idea of the Bengal Renaissance as a bust tradition is itself quite striking, because anybody who's grown up Bengali will know that it's quite a boom tradition. It's the tradition to which we own our identity. So I'm very intrigued to find out in what sense that is a bust tradition, or has it gone busted? So yeah, I mean, with those rambling thoughts, won't take up much time, but I'll ask you to take up.
Is it okay to close it? I just put my laptop here. Because I just saw the way it's appearing and it looks a bit unfamiliar to me. So I'll have to look for my bust thing, of course. The talk, here it is. Thank you, Saikat, for that characteristically thoughtful and sympathetic introduction. Excuse me? No, the other one is connected. I mean, I may show a few images at the end, or may not, depending on time. So from Bolaño to Calcutta, the Bengal Renaissance as a bust renaissance. I should have spent more time in this essay talking about, or this talk, on the Bengal Renaissance itself. But I found myself then spending time on Chile and Bolaño. So here it is. I found myself in Chile last year, or Chile is the correct pronunciation, right? Last year, because of an invitation my wife had received. I decided to travel with her. Everyone has a vivid notion of Chile, maybe even of Latin America, but no one I knew had been there. My sense of place to do with that part of the world, fed and augmented periodically since I was a teenager by Neruda, Hergé, César Vallejo, whom I mistakenly took to be Chilean, Henri Georges Clouzot's The Wages of Fear, whose location is unspecified, and more recently my lighting upon Sergio Larraín's photos of Valparaiso made it belong in some way to my past. Such locations remind you when you reach them that they have no relation to who you are. But after we arrived at Santiago, we still felt it might have played a part in a half-remembered life of ours, when we were ill, sequestered, and recuperating, and had no access to the outside world except through our imagination. Maybe Chile's own unusual history, its dreadful stasis under Pinochet, its intermittent bouts of transformative turbulence, made it likely that anyone could discover their history in it if they chose to. At the dinner on the first night, I was sitting opposite one of the hosts, Andres Claro. Now I'm the host and he's the speaker invitee. I wasn't a speaker there. Andres, and we began to talk about fiction, probably because Andres was polite enough to bring it up in sympathy with the fact that I was a writer among academics. I clarified early into our conversation that I belonged to a particular minority in the post-globalization world to which the Latin American boom is anathema, as is its principal export, magic realism. Yes, it is a construct, but whatever. Let's keep using it for now. I also decided to come clean and confess that I felt no affinity with the post-Midnight's Children boom in the Indian novel in English. The canopies we were served were excellent, but it's not just food that's palatable or unpalatable. For writers, sustenance is more crucial than success, and one person's meat can certainly be another's poison. no amount of excellent dinners at literary festivals or conferences can distract from or substitute for this need for sustenance. I do like Bolaño, though, for saying he wasn't part of the boom, for saying he was a bust writer, I said. And Andres nodded. I have since then searched for that bit of self-definition, bust writer, which I thought I first encountered in Roberto Bolaño's Wikipedia entry, but I could find no trace of it. His contempt for magic realism, though, it stinks, and his truculence about its chief proponent, Garcia Marquez, quote, a man terribly pleased to have hobnobbed with so many presidents and archbishops, end quote, are well recorded. Did I imagine it then? His rebuttal of the boom and his prescient observation on both his practice and the possibility of an early death, quote, posthumous sounds like the name of a Roman gladiator, one who is undefeated, end quote, were among my reasons for being drawn to Bolaño. Being drawn to, in this case, means not passive readerly interest, but the notion of a confederacy. Writers today may work in the feral isolation the free market has thrown them into, but in certain situations, isolation is not incompatible with practitioners being in conversation with each other. By bust, I mean freeing internecine conversation, which the boom replaces with readings, panels, and public events. The conversations I'm thinking of, whose signs were little magazines and poems typed out, photocopied, and exchanged in coffee shops, were in a sense the subject of Bolaño's short stories. I liked what they were up to but couldn't surrender to them entirely, probably because I didn't take to the translations. I was also nervous that they weren't what they were supposed to be. I'm reminded of what the poet and critic Tom Paulin had said to me in 2002 in New York, over dinner, as we were discussing the emergence of W.G. Sebald, who in retrospect should have brought a quickening of hope to some of us for his evidently obdurate, unviable characteristics. A quote from Tom Paulin, what he said to me, yes, very interesting. It's a kind of postmodern antiquarianism, very like the real thing but a million miles away from it, end quote. I feared the same might be true of Bolaño. There's nothing worse than embracing a writer's work for the life-giving promise it generates through resistance and failure, only to discover that it was pretending to fail. How otherwise could a putatively non-boom writer become indispensable to the boom? For that's what happened on the English language publication of The Savage Detectives following Bolaño's death. He became a bestseller, was incorporated by the boom, not just the Latin American one, but the boom of globalization, and conflated irksomely with Marquez and Vargas Llosa. Surely this wasn't what Bolaño had meant when he had said that he liked the word posthumous for sounding like the name of a Roman gladiator, one who is undefeated. Bolaño's ubiquity after his death feels like a capitulation for which one is tempted to hold him personally responsible. Quotes from The Savage Detectives that I came upon before embarking on this essay have given me pleasure and soothed my misgivings. Here's one. Quote, I'm reading the dead Mexican poets, my future colleagues, end quote. But how does the boom that's created a worshipful cult of Bolaño in the last 20 years remain so unmindful of his vivacious critique of its celebratory mode? How do bust traditions, like the 14th and 15th century Bhakti movement, for instance, find such faithful adherence in the complacent and conventional constituencies they deride? I remember Arvind Krishna Mehrotra saying to me after he'd finished translating Kabir, who is joyous because he's also brutal, quoting Arvind, I wonder if the people who sing his songs actually listen to his words. Bolaño dismissed magic realism and was beholden to Borges and admired Julio Cortázar. With these deaths being declared, the frayed edges of the Latin American boom begin to become visible. Cortázar is not, for Bolaño, part of the boom in which he's often been placed by publishers and reviewers. And Borges, a composer of fragmentary texts whose very purpose was to question the bases on which we conceive of national literatures, as we saw this morning, was never assimilable into the boom. Eventually, as is the case with all traditions, which are not so much a repository of creative shifts as they are their corollary, the act of imagining a bust tradition becomes inevitable, as does in the process inventing the term, to acknowledge that each bust writer has a bust lineage and that the lineage must have a multiplicity of antecedents as well as legatees. Looking for the moment only at the streams of non-Anglophone writing that have had a subterranean meaning for the Anglophone world in the 20th century, I would place Fernando Pessoa alongside Borges as a significant contributor to the legacy of bust. That only a fraction of Pessoa's output was attributed by the poet not to himself but to his heteronyms, the most well-known of which are Alberto Caeiro, Alvaro de Campos, and Ricardo Reis. Each has his own Wikipedia entry, and one figures in the title of a novel, is the evidence of neither an agonistic temperament nor of postmodern effervescence, but of the fact that bust is profuse in a way that the boom can't be. The profusion is underlined, not undermined, by Pessoa's decision to leave much of his work unpublished. This is a variety of excitement that the boom isn't equipped for. The bust writer might reject scale. One of the reasons I was suspicious of Bolaño was the size of the novels, the Savage Detectives in 2066, published after his death, but may court elaboration, dabbling, and repetition in ways not wholly in their control. Julio Ramon Ribeiro, whom we also heard of this morning, the Peruvian writer of short stories and essays, wrote of his boom contemporaries and their history encompassing novels in a note from 1970, quote, "I've always passed by the side of history and have entered life through smaller and more concealed doors, such as private adventure or anecdote," end quote. By the end of his life, however, his notebook and journal entries constituted a vast body of work, a reminder of the sort of bust munificence to do with smaller and more concealed doors that the boom, with its overarching narrative scaffolding, finds it difficult to access. Not publishing is not compulsory for a bust writer. When it occurs, it points to the importance of gestation and waiting, as in the publication of Jean Rhys's White Sargasso Sea after, I think, 2 decades of silence, and to the indistinguishability of the act of withholding from an idea of meaning. Withholding, that is, not saying, is of course a mark of the bust aesthetic and will characterize the work, whether it's a poem, a film, or a painting, in ways that counter boom modes of meaning-making through history, national allegory, and accumulation of detail and information. But for some writers, withholding governs the way they'll make or not make a place for their work in the world. Kafka comes to mind, the bust gesture of reading out his work to friends who responded to its comedy, of leaving it otherwise, largely in his drawer or the equivalent of his drawer, the instructions left to Max Brod to burn it, its gradual incorporation after his death, into the absurdist existentialist boom, which had little time for Kafka's realist specificity or his humor. The novels of the poet Jibanananda Das, another great withholder, are still coming to light. The long sonnet sequence, now called Ruposhi Bangla or Bengal the Beautiful, which the rebel soldiers of the Bangladeshi freedom fighters in the Mukti Bahini read and reread in the early 1970s in the lull amidst battle, was discovered amidst his papers after his death. Most of the English works of the Marathi English poet Arun Kolatkar began to appear shortly before and then after he died in 2006. He had proactively conspired against publication. I hope I've remembered the date of his death correctly, the year of his death. The connection Bolaño makes between the word posthumous and the undefeated gladiator is connected in some of the writers I've mentioned to some peculiar idea of the viability of non-publication. It turns out from their work that a great deal exists invisibly. In fact, invisible existence teems, outnumbering visible existence. This defines not just the conditions pertaining to bust lineages, but is a valid bust thought. It may inform the seeming irony of Borges's narrator's opening sentence in Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote, quote, "The visible work left by this novelist is easily and briefly enumerated," end quote. The italics in which the word visible is put, denoting a derisory wave of the hand before the commentator moves on to the crucial invisible, perhaps unwritten body of work. The anthropomorphism of the term body of work is put paid to by the bust tradition's disengagement from what only has features and outline. Having finished his enumeration of the visible legacy, the narrator turns to Menard's, quote, "other work, the subterranean, the interminably heroic, the peerless. And such are the capacities of man, the unfinished," end quote. Okay. If the boom were a moment in recent history alone, or a periodic publishing phenomenon, it wouldn't be of concern to Bolaño or, for that matter, to my argument. Bolaño and I and many others here, presumably, grew up in and were formed by the epoch of bust, of socialist economies, trade unions, non-aligned nations, the ideas of austerity and poetry. We entered the boom without being consulted about it. I was roughly 28 when it happened. Bolaño was 37. I'm speaking about the fall of the Berlin Wall leading to the onset of our reality, the deregulated market and globalization. The boom has been our environment for the last 30 years. Its absoluteness as the one available system is unprecedented. Booms have existed as cultural or intellectual movements for centuries, of course. A boom is a form of triumphalism whose recruits are buzzing with purpose and activity. They are commodifying a theme, often on moral grounds, and there's a ceaseless energy to this commodification that's unconnected to how depressing the theme might be. This is because whatever theme or ideology it concerns itself with, it is its own self-justifying upbeat ideology, the boom. We are, for instance, in the midst of an Anthropocene boom. I was hesitant to approach any of the thousands of academics who are now busy with the Anthropocene to speak about bust, because many of them are contributing to a discourse that's ostensibly booming. Similarly, there was once a modernism boom, an existentialist boom, an absurdist boom, each related partly to the interpretative apparatus provided by the Holocaust. In India, we have had in the time of globalization, a partition boom in the novel. I mean that historical extremity can begin to take on a narrative and allegorical shape and become an instance of boom-like celebration in which participation is mandatory. The modernism boom that gripped 20th century criticism was energized by the notion that modernism was an allegory of Western disenchantment, its fractures evidence of breakdown caused by sudden societal change. This account bores me. I personally see modernism as a bust movement, its fragmentary syntax not metaphysical or grand, but eccentric, wayward, and buoyant. Its provenance is polycultural, comprising non-representational traditions inside and outside the West. I don't think modernism can serve as an allegory for modern European history. As with all bust modes, it's free from the obligation to represent histories or historical shifts that are assigned centrality. I asked myself, what was the first boom? The answer I immediately opt for is the Italian Renaissance, hoping the choice will be contradicted or responded to with an enumeration of booms preceding it. Yet for me, its legacy was, even prior to globalization, a formative experience of constraint, suffocation, packaged spirituality and humanity, and of the irrefutably large scale. Its Philistinism and proximity to power was imposed upon us inadvertently in the classroom as the cultural and educational norm. I'm using Renaissance as a shorthand for a cluster of coordinates: the dominance of the Enlightenment, the emergence of capitalism, the 16th century refashioning of the classical, that is, its privileging of an idea of Greek antiquity, extending itself with the neoclassicism in Western and Southern Europe in the 19th century. The Renaissance is a pervasive cultural style. It relies with unprecedented emphasis on one feature, the representational, which it hones through a masterful realism. Ancient Greece and its fetishization of the human figure, where the curl in the hair, a fold in the gown, or the precise slope of the buttock are all-consuming preoccupations, make the real possible on a monumental scale. Whatever likeness the sculpture offers, whether of Apollo or Christ or Lorenzo de Medici in Florence, the primary likeness it embraces decisively is of reality itself. The Renaissance is a representational boom. By the 18th century, perspective and oil in painting teach Western Europe and then the world not just how to replicate the real, but what reality is. The indistinguishability between mastering reality and instructing us what reality might be is foundational to the conceit of development. Only a finished reality, completed to the last detail, is legitimately real. By logical extension, the representational mode's ambition to teach us how to paint the past or history is also meant to convince us that this is the only way in which the past has reality. All history becomes representational or real, or, given the indispensability of this idiom, classical in the Renaissance sense. Conversely, and just as persuasively, only the representational is historical. Religious scenes, as in Caravaggio's painting Supper at Emmaus, are treated by the Renaissance as historical episodes, perspective and the naturalism of light and shade uniting to tell us not just that this episode actually occurred, but that this is the manner in which it would have if it had. This lesson is of significance to BJP's India and its investment in a truth defined by realism as the proper way for, say, Lord Ram to be seen by us. Ram is becoming the Ram of representational reality. The other Rams, right up to the Pahadi and Kangra figures of the 19th century, will be slowly erased from official iconography. They are not realistic. Consequently, they aren't historical, and vice versa. The word Renaissance means rebirth, but also in Europe indicates erasure. As history and mythology are reborn as representation, they become at once immemorial and make redundant whatever preceded them. In the Place Saint-Michel in Paris is a statue of the archangel in front of the fountain, his face looking disapprovingly down at the crawling devil below, both arms raised, the right one carrying an admonitory sword, his wings made up of layers of magnificent feathers framing each shoulder, his chest and stomach armor-plated. As it's made along classical lines, it seems to have been there forever. It has no provenance except in the vague domain of history. What existed in its place earlier, what might have been destroyed to make space for it, or the fact that it was designed and installed in 1860 by the architect Gabriel Daviau, is of little concern to us. Globalization's perpetual now is anticipated by the definitive historical air of neoclassical representation. For me, the Renaissance is a masterful project of enormous dimensions, an auto-imperialism that takes charge of how a nation produces its own culture and thought. It must have decimated innumerable particularities and local angularities to achieve a massive makeover of the European past through the power of the representational. It configured how we, and crucially Europeans, now think of and look at Europe. The idiom of hyperreal representation has many offshoots, of which Orientalism is only one. Orientalism, as a variety of the representational boom, was and is practiced by both Europeans and those who were once called Orientals. Indians of every variety, liberals, the right, novelists, op-ed writers, tell us of our history by first reminding us how real it is. Not long from now, people will forget there was anything earlier where the new Ram Mandir stands in Ayodhya, not because of some government directive, but the authority imparted to it and the deity within by an innately historical air. This temper is a derivation from classical European antiquity, so crucial to the Oriental boom. An anecdote about two Arnolds discloses to us something of the boom as well as the bust itineraries of the Orient. It was related to me by my wife. She was then writing a doctoral dissertation at Oxford. We were bemused by the proclivities at that time, in the early 90s, of literary publishing in the recently globalized world, as a result of which Indian novels were known for two things: being about India and the size of the author's advance on royalties. It's happened before, she said, and told me about Thomas More, the Irish poet, who received the 3,000 guinea advance in 1818 for the Orientalist poem Lala Rukh, and also Edwin Arnold's narrative poem about the life of the Buddha, The Light of Asia, published in 1879, which had such success that it went through 80 editions in America and 60 in Britain by 1920, and was described by Oliver Wendell Holmes as being comparable only with the New Testament. When the slightly older poet and critic and advocate of high seriousness in literature, Matthew Arnold, went to America, he found to his embarrassment that the ship he arrived on was received by crowds who had confused him with Edwin. In Edwin and his narrative poem, bear in mind that narrative by the 19th century has become interchangeable with representational, we see the Oriental boom stretching to the Orient. Among Edwin Arnold's admirers was Gandhi. The politician Jairam Ramesh recently published a biography of the man. Even Borges, in an interview, thought Matthew Arnold had written a poem about the Buddha. Such is the power of the boom to make news. It's not as if Matthew Arnold was uninterested in Indian thought. On the contrary, the eccentric, non-representational arguments of the Gita are key to how he conceives of disinterestedness in criticism. For Arnold believes that disinterestedness is not a quasi-scientific objectivity in evaluation, but a liberation from the idea of outcome. This non-purposive stream of reasoning is deeply indebted to an influential bust itinerary of poetic criticism from India, which went on to galvanize modernism. Its contribution to the shaping of modernism is more important but less well known than the antecedents that the light of Asia springs from. Around the 1860s, a shift occurred in Bengali self-consciousness that manifested itself through the creation of an anomalous literary and cultural sphere. I say anomalous because Bengali literature from Kali Prasanna Singho, Madhusudhan Datta, and Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, all publishing around the 1860s and after, onwards, refused to be a culturally nationalistic or identitarian project, but was substantially an experiment in poetic language and formal play. The move from English and its hitherto minor creative practices in India to Bengali signified a gradual move away from nationalism, most available in India through, paradoxically, the English language, towards the ambiguous domain of modernity. From the 1860s onwards, Bengali, and I think this is true of other Indian literatures that are born or reborn at the time, becomes the language of the modern, encompassing all the poetic contradictions and transient potential of that word, rather than of those who are besotted with the idea of India. By now, Bengal has already seen immense transformations in the social and intellectual sphere. By the now, I mean 1860s. The Indian liberal begins to appear by the late 18th, early 19th century, embodied most conveniently in the figure of Ram Mohan Roy. And Roy is connected to at least two activities that either determine or are characteristic of liberal modernity in India. The first is the creation of a quasi-Unitarian movement within Hinduism called the Brahmo Samaj, a humane, almost atheistic monotheism within quotes, that's invested in a luminous, immanent deity without attribute or outline, a Nirakar Brahma, that's a resurfacing of a concept called Brahman in the Upanishads. Atheistic monotheism. I use this formulation because monotheism is the worship of one God, and while Brahman is one, he or it is not God in any recognizable sense. This monotheism, which can't be called monotheism at all except through mistranslation, is an important foundational step towards the creation of secularism in the Indian liberal order. The second of Ram Mohan Roy's activities and those of his generation that also become characteristic of the Indian liberal and progressive have to do with pioneering social reform and activism. The emergence of an educated middle class or gentlefolk, Bhadralok, in the early to mid-19th century with either reformist ambitions or professional ones, leading eventually to a class of doctors, lawyers, and engineers. The cultural and literary sphere of the late 19th century situated in, but at odds with, the Bengali liberal sphere, increasingly advocating, especially with the key figure of Tagore, poetic language and enchantment, and prejudiced against all forms of linearity. These phenomena, taken together, comprise what has retrospectively been called the Bengal Renaissance. So we have the progressive liberal, and we have the daydreaming scion of the liberal. So almost out of Thomas Mann. The genealogy of this once ubiquitous and now much mocked term isn't straightforward. Versions were created in Bengali by major 19th century figures. This mock term, the Bengal Renaissance. The reformer and thinker Keshab Chandra Sen and the scholar Shivnath Shastri both use Nobo Jagoron, new awakening. The historian Jodunath Sarkar points out in 1948 in the History of Bengal that what had happened in his book, The History of Bengal, that what had happened in Bengal in the 19th century was, quote, truly a renaissance, wider, deeper, and more revolutionary than that of Europe after the fall of Constantinople, end quote. By then, the Marxist historian Shushoban Sarkar had already published his slim book Notes on the Bengal Renaissance in 1946, a title that seemed to take the term as a given. It was Sarkar's title that probably canonized the term. There was also another word, an English one, used of this 19th century awakening in Bengali, enlightenment. I've dispensed with the definite article as the word was incorporated into Bengali, as in, tokhon enlightenment hoyechilo. That was when enlightenment happened. And Bengali makes no use of the definite article. It's possible to set up a subtle distinction between enlightenment, as it was spoken of in Bengali, and the Enlightenment in Europe. The latter is synonymous with a post-faith human-centric outlook for which science and rationality dominate. Its light emanates from the human subject. It's he who sees and studies the universe in the light of reason. Derrida alerts us to the implications of control and distance accompanying this vantage point. Phrases like I see or in the light of, embedded in the structure of everyday language, propose the primacy of the reasoning observing subject and their aloofness from, and as a consequence, their mastery over the world that's being observed. What should we make of the light in enlightenment in Bengali usage, or the light implied by Jagoran, since one doesn't awake into the dark? If you look at the generational shift in male Bengali names, you notice a secularization, not just a non-religious sense of the secular, but an a-religious idea of sacredness via light. Tagore's grandfather's name, Dwarkanath, has a Hindu meaning, Lord Nath of Dwarka, another name for Krishna. Tagore's father's name, Debendranath, means Lord of Indra or Lord of the King of the Gods. With Tagore, whose name Robindranath means Lord of the Sun, we move towards a canvas emptied of particular gods and goddesses and defined only by light. This canvas is a space without outline or form. It reflects the Brahma Samaj's investment through the Upanishad's Brahman in a Nirakar deity, Nirakar meaning without akar or outline. Sometimes this deity is only called Nirakar, and the word Brahma or any other word approximating God like Ishwar is left unsaid, with the weight falling not on the idea of divinity but on what can't be represented. In the generations that follow Tagore's, more male names that have no religious specificity and which suggest the formless start to occur. Arun, meaning the sun. Amitava, one of the Buddha's names, meaning light without end. There's my own name, Amit, a favorite of Tagore's, which means endless, and to which embarrassingly my father added a middle name, Prakash, meaning light. So that together the names mean endless light. These names are concomitant with the cultural trajectory indebted to formlessness. And since this formlessness or emptiness accrues to itself a meaning, it's luminous. We encounter in it the fullness of the non-representational. Unlike the European Enlightenment, we find no subject position here. An emptiness without outline makes impossible the demarcation that creates the reasoning and observing subject. There's only one reality, which is Nirakar. For all its progressivism, this is an ethos that's unwilling to fully participate in the European representational boom. The light in Bengal's enlightenment is a bust, non-representational, empty light. The Bengal Renaissance nowadays comes with a prefix that serves as a safeguard, so-called. It's a way of using the term while disowning its meaning, a procedure Heidegger called erasure. The reason for this disavowal was a turn in the 1960s in the left liberal conscience. Shushoban Sarkar, having published notes on the Bengal Renaissance in 1946, wrote a kind of recantation 21 years later called Conflict Within the Bengal Renaissance. He, like other historians on the left and subaltern studies historians who had been influential in the decades to follow, accused the Bengal Renaissance of being elite, upper caste, upper class, and exclusionary. Orup Kumar Sen summarizes their position in a succinct letter published in the Economic and Political Weekly in 2018. Quote, "It did move on the axis of the upper stratum alone of society, the Bhadraloks." I mean, they moved, or what the Renaissance moved. It could not draw in the Muslim community and the masses of backward Hindus, end quote. The overarching criticism was an ontological one. The Bengal Renaissance couldn't be a true Renaissance because it couldn't possibly measure up to the benchmark created by, in other words, it couldn't possibly be, the European Renaissance. It happened, as the historian Amolish Tripathi dutifully pointed out, in the context of colonial subjugation and economic conditions engendered by colonization. It's hubris to think that the Renaissance of a subject people can have veracity. At most, it was the delusion of a new class of Bengalis besotted with Medici's Rome. You feel in retrospect that both the Bengal Renaissance and its critics suffered from belatedness. It was beyond the remit of the discussion that Tripathi, Sarkar, and others participated in to, however, consider what, in fact, the legacy of the European Renaissance was, and whether it should have been embraced or countered, and if so, in what way. The task of questioning that legacy was taken up in the late 19th and early 20th centuries across the world, and notably in India and Bengal, not by historians and social scientists, but by poets, artists, and filmmakers. The Bengal Renaissance, if we look at it again as a post-1860s cultural and imaginative style, never aspired to be the European Renaissance at all. Quite the opposite, it is a powerful critique of the representational. It's a bust Renaissance. There are a number of ways in which we can map definitive divergences in Bengali modernity from the European Renaissance's dominant mode of representational realism. I will look at a few briefly before ending this talk by discussing three houses. In Tagore, from the late 1880s to the end of the 19th century, we see repeated interrogations of linearity and historiography, both essential to representational narratives. He rejects in a short essay called Sahitya, or literature, written in the Tagore family album in 1889, unpublished until well after his death, the idea of construction or nirman, that is, quote, to consciously exercise the authority of the self over inert materials, end quote, in favor of, quote, a mysterious, vital, self-oblivious order, end quote, he calls creation, within quotes, or srishti. The withdrawal from the task of nirman is a non-narrative gesture, a veering away from the, quote, exercise of authority that leads to culture or nation building. Literature can't construct these things. Its powers of srishti or creation constitute then, contradictorily, a state of bust. In the poems and essays on the 4th century Sanskrit poet Kalidas that Tagore writes in the 1890s, history is real only when it resists possession. His long poem Meghdut on reading Kalidas's poem of the same name makes the act of reading an entry point into a brief bodiless visit to 4th century Ujjain. A sense of transport occurs while Tagore is sitting in his room. There's no attempt to write history here. The act of reading is a metaphor for the incompleteness of and the desire for possession. It's through the thwarting of that desire that the historical comes alive or is created. The poem ends, so does Tagore's immersion in Kalidas's poem. Historical time is not represented, but subsumed under the poem's duration. The non-representational turn that Tagore contributes to ramifies gradually in the Bengal Renaissance's attempt to create a bust language across media and genres, however much it might slip into idealization with, say, some Abanindranath images that we saw today. But there's also another side to Abanindranath. A bust language across media and genres, including, especially among the artists gathered in Shantiniketan, the visual arts. Early on, they opt for the provisionality of watercolor and tempera over oil. This is in contravention of the methods being taught at the time in the government colleges of art or the larger sphere of academic painting that's imparting the Italian Renaissance's lessons of representationalism worldwide. A counter language to the boom is being created by Tagore's nephews Gaganendranath and Abanindranath and their students Nandalal Bose, Binod Bihari Mukherjee and others in the early 20th century. Partly the bust visual languages is arrived at by reconfiguring what one might loosely call tradition. When we say traditional art in a European context, we at once think of conventional realism and representational figures. When we say modern, we think abstract. In Bengal and India, what's happening is a more circuitous route towards the bust language of modernism because it's the art of the past that is abstract, stylized, partially realistic or not at all, and formalistic. What's new is the representational art coming in from the West. The Indian avant-garde will tap into the vital formalism of tradition to bring into existence a non-representational idiom. The paintings of Jamini Roy come to mind. Roy is worth mentioning because people think he's trying, via the art of the anonymous Potuas, to fashion an authentic Bengali iconography. He is not. He's in conversation with the formalistic language of modernity. Formalism undermines and liberates the art from the representational qualities of the Enlightenment idea of culture and nation. A class of educated Bhadralok was being created in Bengal by the late 19th century that was embracing a bust style in its clothing and habitational aesthetic. I'm dating this roughly, basing it on an episode related in Ashoka Chaudhuri's essay Modernity at Home about the poet Nobin Chandra Sen's visit to the novelist Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's home in the 1870s, when he notes that the home is sparsely furnished in comparison to English people's and wealthy Bengali families' houses of that period. There are no figurines and statues. The clutter, and the word clutter is borrowed from a Bankim Chandra essay about furniture in the home of English people and the young Bengal, a particular kind of group. The clutter of drawing room furniture is missing. Empty space abounds. Cotton mattresses on the floor instead of chairs are used for sitting on. You'll see some of this around here, some residue of that aesthetic. Not right here, there are a lot of chairs over here. Texture and surface, such as choir, rather than statues, glass, and china, will dominate this culture and its interiors. Women will wear saris that will often be an expanse of a single color, making for the portraits of women by Jamini Roy that are almost non-representational, portraits of women by Jamini Roy that are almost non-representational and empty except for the marks that constitute the face. By the 1960s, India has bedspreads originating in designers like Riten Majumdar that rework the deep formalism of folk prints. During festivities, especially during the Durga Pujas in the autumn, a class of atheistic worshippers will protest when the images of Durga aren't traditional. By this, they mean they aren't sufficiently formalistic, abstract, and stylized, as the originary images were. Too many of the new images have the unctuous realism of a Titian. They balk at it. When they say they miss the traditional images, they're speaking as habitual addicts of the non-representational. I'm speaking of a class, a period, a moment that has almost entirely passed. The representational boom gripped India around the time the bust renaissance was being fashioned. The paintings of the gifted Ravi Verma, we saw some of those paintings today, reworked so intriguingly and wonderfully by Pushpamala. The paintings of the gifted Ravi Verma, 1848 to 1906, refulgent portraits of Indian gods and goddesses. I say portraits rather than visions or cosmologies because of the kind of realism they inaugurate, start to enter the consciousness after the 1870s. Popular art, sacred images in calendars and prints, is almost entirely informed by German-style technique and, as with Verma, the legacy of Renaissance oil painting. A great shift in consciousness is taking place with the national, the sacred, and later Hinduism, as we now know, becoming real in representational historical terms. The apogee of this sensibility, which once also marked the liberals' excessive regard for historiography, is to be found in the BJP's makeover of the Jallianwala Bagh corridor, its monumentalization of Banaras's ghats and temples, and its snarling Ashokan lions. Let me now come to three buildings in North Calcutta, two of which, the Marble Palace and Tagore's ancestral home in Jorashako, I have visited more than once. They are both tourist sites, though a part of the Mullik Badi or Marble Palace is occupied by its owners and isn't open to display. The third building I discovered very recently, the Tagore Palace in Pathuria Ghata, in which its owners still live. They're all a 10 or 15 minute walk from each other. They came up between the late 18th and the late 19th century. The household at Jorashako was the result of a split in the Tagore family, with the more conservative wing now identified with mansions at Pathuria Ghata, and the bit of the family that became Brahmo, into which Tagore was born, with Jorashako. There's another distinction to be made. If you go to the Marble Palace or the Pathuria Ghata house, you'll encounter a style that would have shaped the middle-class sense of interiors and space in Bengal, and maybe in India, had the Italian Renaissance been its dominant aesthetic inheritance. The Marble Palace, built in 1835 by a Bengali gold merchant, is distinguished by its inspired surreal maze of statues, including gigantic likenesses of Queen Victoria, figures, birds in cages, and paintings that include Verma and putatively a Rubens. Much of this is framed on either side of the unfolding rooms once used for gatherings and soirees by great Belgian glass mirrors that are more transparent than air. In the Pathuria Ghata Tagore Palace, the Dalan, that is the raised platform at the courtyard's end, and its antechamber, are punctuated by a series of somber busts of the key members of this branch of the Tagore family. The representational boom, from Greek classical antiquity onwards, has depended on busts to remind us of the historic nature of certain individuals. Plato's busts go back to the 4th and 5th century BCE. In this sense, the neoclassical boom, in which busts and statues of important or affluent individuals proliferate, is also a bust tradition. Bust, but as in bust. When you go to the family home of Rabindranath Tagore in Jorashako, you may or may not notice the absence of statuary and busts and the lack of the figurative. You may subconsciously note the lavishness of spatiality, the meditativeness of the rooms. We are in the heart of Bengal's Renaissance, and everywhere we encounter its creation of emptiness as a taking stock of reality. You may be struck by more recent developments, of course, the awfulness of whatever curation and reverential signage there is, pointing us to a world outside, to which the boom is necessary, and which there are in which there are statues and pictures of Rabindranath in every park, airport, and street corner. But within, in the choir mats and low furniture and long verandas, are the living vestiges of this Renaissance. So that is the talk, and maybe I can just show you very quickly in a few seconds the busts of the boom tradition, or how the boom tradition depends on bust. In this case, the boom tradition we are talking about is the representational tradition within Bengal, which never really took off. I mean, it took off, but it never, in our minds, has the centrality of bust, the non-bust bust. That's one. That's right at the end. There's like a long dalan, as I said, raised platform at the end of the courtyard. And this is a wonderful family, as shown around very generously, and they let me take photos. That's another one inside, in the chamber inside, which looks astonishingly. It's a Bengali woman. I thought it was some sort of Greek. Anyway, this is again, we've come outside. So there's a whole row of these busts. I noticed them and thought immediately that there's nothing like this in Jorashako. I'd noticed the emptiness in Jorashako before, but not the absence of statuary. But then I thought, yes, but these other buildings do have a lot of neoclassical. This is like a holy person, but built on the same realist lines. The figure within. Pushpamala might do something with this maybe at some point. Anyway, so there we are. I think I've shown all of them, and those are the busts. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, we see the bust tradition in its material form. So we've been talking about the meaning. I mean, it's obviously, as with much of what you say and write, there's so much richness, but what stands out to me is the sense of mischief, which also is something I've come to identify with your intervention in culture and history. It's very mischievous, the silences, the ellipses, the not publishing, and it all leads up to this really some striking insights that, the term Bengal Renaissance, a retrospective coinage, and retrospective coinages are bizarre things. You kind of look back and describe things in terms which the contemporaries never thought in those terms, so that makes it very interesting. And then, as I always felt the place of the sensory, that how the question of the senses, the vision, the openness. But again, the mischief, what I found was that it kind of goes back to the non-sensory, that it's really not about representation. It's representation is a kind of a sham, that realism. And that's exactly why the Renaissance doesn't quite work. So this is what I have always taken away from, your thoughts, that in the end, the ideas kind of play with each other and sort of remain in a kind of a hide and seek. It's not something like a thesis, but there's that really fascinating sense of, kind of mischief again is the word that comes. But I'd love to hear from what others think and how. Yes, Tarun?
Thank you so much to think about. So it just occurred to me as you were speaking that perhaps what Bolaño in The Savage Detectives was doing was It's a novel about poets, isn't it? So there's a kind of interesting interplay, as it were, between translation and the quest for a lost archive, which ultimately remains perhaps unfulfilled. And in that context, I was wondering if one could think of what he was doing there as a kind of manifestation of this bust aesthetic, as a form of decentering. A kind of decentering aesthetic is sort of evolving there. And perhaps one could track this back to figures like Juan Rulfo, Pedro Paramo, slightly, again, offbeat, if you like, figure, not quite like the boom figures who then became more predominant. In the context of the reference you made to partition, similarly, I was wondering if one could contrast this aspiration to write the great partition novel as a boom manifestation with the more decentered tradition of figures like Manto, later Shashi Deshpande, who are invoking histories of traumatic violence, historical trauma, in a slightly different register, if you like. So again, whether this is sort of fruitful with respect to your thinking about this question of boom and bust.
Yeah. I mean, each one of these boom traditions is a kind of metaphysical position which asks us to disengage from what is generally the aspiration or the desire of all forms of art, generally, not 100%, generally, to engage with physicality. And by engaging with physicality, to engage with a constant sense of change as being the defining characteristic of physicality and language. That seems to me art seems to be the one discourse reminding us of this, and reminding us of the kind of delight in being decentered, but also being asked to see anew from moment to moment. It seems to be the one discourse in which has no fixed theme or subject. Once you create a metaphysical position out of it, like the partition novel, or partition literature, or any one of the other kind of boom traditions that I talked about, within, say, even 20th century writing, like the kinds of things that I heard about when I was a teenager or encountered, like absurd, the word absurd. The word existential was doing the rounds when I was 16 or 17. Provide you with this kind an opportunity for disengagement from that changing language, and then I mean, you stop seeing as a result of inhabiting that metaphysical position. You actually stop seeing the kind of things you're talking about. You know, it's not only the local or the more ordinary, but the fact that an act of wonder sort of informs or animates every situation, even the ones that we try to categorize as, say partition. A wonder in terms of life and the moment. The moment and and life in the moment are part of all of those situations, and art or writing is animated by this contingency, whether it's partition or not partition. But the moment you put it within a category, you stop disengaging with that temporality. And my own personal experiences of this has to do with, well, I mean, Kafka, for instance, is somebody who's very much a part of a metaphysical sort of narrative in which you then stop really, I mean, at least as a teenager, and I think there are a lot of people who don't actually see what's going on in Kafka in terms of detail, in terms of its moment-to-moment engagement with life and consciousness of life. And physicality and physical detail is a part of this. I mean, for instance, there is a change in Gregor's dietary preferences after he becomes an insect. He no longer likes what he used to like before. It's his sister who finally notices this. He realizes his brother is as an insect, which she doesn't. That seems to be irrelevant to her at that point of time. Is falling ill because he's not eating. She thinks, what can I give him that will be appetizing to him? And she takes out, I think, and there's a whole list of chicken bone with a bit of the congealed white sauce, things that had been thrown into the trash, and also we are informed, at least in Michael Hoffman's translation, a piece of cheese which Gregor had only last week said was unfit for human consumption. Now, once you are in that metaphysical position, you don't engage with any of these things. You don't realize that Kafka has written about appetite, and appetite in a kind of in this sort of specific way that somehow captures the moment. These are all ephemeral, transient material things, which are of endless sustenance as they are to Gregor, to the artist. So I would say the same of Bergman, for instance. When I was a teenager, I used to go and watch Bergman to be instructed in the existential and the absurd. It was only later I realized that he is an extremely funny and also very sensuous filmmaker. So the worldliness of art, of writing, and its incorporation of and its wandering sort of relationship with perishable material goes out of the window. Whether it's partition literature, or once we enter that metaphysical realm, partition literature, this or that, there have to be any number of things, as you mentioned, Manto, which occur during the partition, which contain the trauma of partition, and which contain the joy of life. As Nietzsche said, to embrace life is to embrace all of it. You can't say that I'll embrace the nice bits and not the bad bits. So it has all of that in it. But once it becomes partition literature, then it is a depiction of partition by Manto, and that's it.
Questions? Yeah, Satish?
I was particularly struck by the busts at the end, and there are, I don't know, I mean, growing up in a city like Calcutta or Bengal, and this is not just specific to Bengal alone, but there are certain very specific kinds of Europeannesses that we just take for granted. I mean, like, whether it be a bird bath or a crown molding ceiling or things like that. And it's almost to the point where this sort of Europeanness borders on being indigenous. And so I was wondering if you'd say a little bit about that.
Certainly. So the word European itself is such an interesting, rich word, which for us in a colonial country might encompass, well, it encompasses a lot of stuff, in the sense that it encompasses a colonial reality. If the colonial reality were constituted the British, then it comprises a sort of puritanism, a puritanical sort of inheritance. However, the puritanical inheritance, I mean, we have very little Neo-Gothic in Calcutta. And I'm not even saying Neo-Gothic is part of that inheritance, but the puritanical inheritance in terms of architecture doesn't really make itself felt in Calcutta that much through the legacy that the British left behind. What they leave behind is a kind of neoclassicism. So you go to Chorungi and you see all these sort of Corinthian pillars and Palladian arches or whatever, pediments. The most interesting bits of Calcutta have an amazing and variable mix of housing styles, which include, styles which are deemed to emerge from Bengal, which is why certain houses were called bungalows after Bengal. They also have those French slatted or Portuguese slatted windows. In early Kalighat pots, you see Shiv and his entourage standing in front of a building with French slatted windows. So the European also then, along with certain strains that have embraced certain bits of Europeanness, have an anti-neoclassical resonance in Calcutta in terms of its architecture. So there is the neoclassical stuff, the official buildings left by the British, and then there's all the other stuff, which is very modern, includes and incorporates European traces, and seems to play around with them as an alternative to this idea of the neoclassical house. Art Deco is the latest of those, and we have a huge variety of Art Deco styles in Calcutta, which came up in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So Indian art, Indian writers, Indian artists, this is true of all of them, not just Bengal, took decisions about their affinities. And there was a conversation going on about between certain styles, in the creation of certain styles, which were rejecting the more dominant modes of representation. So when we say they're looking to Europe, or Europe is borrowing from India, when Europe is borrowing from India, it's not borrowing mysticism, it's borrowing something again to create a style that goes against ideas of representation that come as an Enlightenment inheritance. And similarly, when Indians are looking to Europe, they're again going against these representational solidities that are also being dumped on us to create something really vivacious and vibrant. Again, the metaphysical position means that when Europeans come to India, they don't recognize this. They see certain things where they see the Taj Mahal and they see poverty, but they will not see Art Deco. You have to point it out to them. That's Art Deco. Art Deco, they'll immediately think, oh, this must be from maybe this is colonial. No, it's not colonial. It's Indian. It's Indian modernity, anti-neoclassical Indian modernity. Otherwise, it would have gone down a particular route, which it is going down in a sense right now, through the aspirations of Hindutva. And similarly, Indians, when they go out to Europe, on some level, they're always seeing the neoclassical everywhere. I think Europeans are too, maybe. They academically know that there is something called modernism. Yes, there was some kind of development in the West. This is a Western person thinking. We Western people, we created modernism at some point. Yes, it happened. Yes, of course, the West was Titian and Raphael. That's basically what it is. When it's the layperson thinking, and then yes, or not even the layperson. And we too follow that. We go abroad and think, well, this is Europe. We don't see the conversation that was created in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries across the world against an Enlightenment and Renaissance style. And that animates the cities and ways of thinking and habitation in very different ways, but in related ways. It is a conversation.